So welcome to the Global Network webinars. My name is Alexander Loschke and I will be moderating this webinar today together with my colleagues Jussi, Sean and Fanya. We are very happy to have with us today Marina Smailes from Statistics Canada, who will be talking about Canada's experience on piloting an open source calculation of SDG indicator 11.7.1. Marina is part of the Data Exploration and Integration Lab at Statistics Canada and will present the results from an open source pilot project calculating this indicator, which is the average share of the built up area of cities that is open space for public use for all. And this disaggregated by sex, age, and persons with disabilities. Marina and her team have taken the example of Vancouver in the Canadian province of British Columbia for their pilot. The presentation will have a technical focus on methods for calculating the indicator, including the open source processing pipeline and development of key inputs. The degree of urbanization, open public space data, and road network data. Marina will also discuss the next steps for the expanding of the analysis and future work with indicator 11.7.1 at Statistics Canada. So let me now present our speaker a little bit more in detail. As mentioned before, Marina is a senior analyst with a data exploration and integration lab at Statistics Canada. She studied geography at McGill University, where she developed a passion for GIS during her Bachelor of Arts in Science. Her current work focuses on geospatial analysis and open data, exploring SDG indicators as well as other granular data projects. Before I hand over to Ronald, who will also say a few words, let me quickly mention some practical things. So we will first hear the presentation of our speaker and will then have a Q&A session at the end. Please feel free to write comments and questions into the meeting chat at any time. And then during the Q&A, please raise your hand to ask your question yourself, or if you wish, we can ask the question for you as well. Just let us know. As always, this Global Network webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Global Network of Data Officers and Statisticians at yammer.com/unstats. We invite you to continue the discussions on the Global Network after the webinar. And now I will hand over to Ronald, who also wanted to say a few words. Ronald, please go ahead.
Thank you, Alex, and a good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'm Ronald Jensen. I'm with the UN Statistics Division in New York, and I'm leading a team on data innovation and capacity management. Within our work on data innovation, my group is supporting the UN Committee of Experts on Big Data and Data Science. And that's a committee that reports also to the Statistical Commission, and the mandate for that group is to see how new data sources, new technologies, new methods can be used for statistical officers to improve estimation of official statistics and indicators, specifically also the SDG indicators. It's not that easy to find good new methods to estimate indicators, and I'm very happy today that Marina will be here to show how this can be done for indicator 11.7.1. I think that is a good example of what can be done, how data science can be used. What we did with this committee of experts internationally, we created, this was with the support initially, big support from the Office of National Statistics of the UK, of putting a global platform, a collaborative environment in the cloud, so that we could do innovation projects. That platform's also been made available to this research group at Stats Canada. And one of the reasons I think why this is useful is that then the results of what that team is doing could be shared internationally with others, and we could also have other researchers work on this. So I'm very happy to hear from Marina about the project, and also to see how this could be used. So now you're using it in Vancouver. How could those methods be used, for instance, in Rio de Janeiro? Because we know that some of the Brazilian colleagues are very interested to see how they could use it. So to hear about that, how the data pipeline is set up on the platform, or the plans for doing that. So those things, I'm very eager to hear about it. Also want to mention that that we've over the years already worked quite closely with Alessandro Alessia, who is I think leading the team on research in this area at Stats Canada. But don't want to take more time away from Marina. So Marina or Alex, back to you guys.
And thank you, Ronald. I will not say much more. Marina, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you for being with us. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Ronald and Alex, for the introduction. I'm just loading my presentation at the moment. Take a second or two. But yes, very excited to discuss how this can be applied internationally and shared with colleagues. And that was definitely a big portion of the project, determining a methodology that could be shared quite widely. So I'll be presenting the results of our one second, sorry, just loading now. There we go. I'll be presenting the results of the pilot project, and then also sharing some of the information about how we plan to move forward and share further. And the end goal is to be able to provide something that code that people can dig into and explore for their own purposes. So as Alexander mentioned, I'll be presenting on the Sustainable Development Goals open source pilot project, measuring it in the Greater Vancouver area within British Columbia. And I will go over quickly a background of the indicator for those who are less familiar, going over the data and methods with the degree of urbanization input, the open public spaces and streets, as well as access to those open public spaces, and then go over the results and next steps of this project. So SDG indicator 11.7.1 is the average share of built up area of cities that is open space for public use for all by age, sex, and persons with disabilities. It falls under goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. So why is this important? From a Statistics Canada perspective, for us, it is new analysis that leverages alternative geospatial data from open sources, which is something that our team within the Data Exploration and Integration Lab has worked on previously. We work with lots of different departments across the Canadian federal government to provide more granular insights, especially recently in terms of access to amenities. So this is a growing area of research, and this indicator very much overlaps with some of the other work that we've been doing, and we find a lot of interest in federally as well as with other provincial partners and also municipal analysis as well. It's also a great way to collaborate with internal and international partners, both through things like this webinar, as Ronald mentioned, sharing on the UN Global Platform, and being able to provide this both for the indicator measures, but also potentially for other areas of analysis too. And I'll go into that a bit further, but basically how we design this to kind of fit a mix and match approach, I guess, depending on what kind of data and approach different groups are looking to take. So conceptually, 56% of the population lives in an urban area. We have a very urban population in Canada as well, with 72% of Canadians living in a census metropolitan area. Census metropolitan area, or CMA, is one of our census geographies. It covers essentially Canada's major cities, including some of the surrounding municipalities, if they have a high degree of integration with the core, such as with the commuting flows, etc. And we know that open public spaces make cities livable. They provide recreation and temperature mitigation and social experience, as well as supporting the health and well-being of residents. So with an increasingly urban population, especially in Canada, understanding how cities are livable, what type of amenities people can access in them is very important. So the main goals for this project were to not only test out this indicator at Statistics Canada, but to test it out in a certain way. And that involves using a automated and scalable processing pipeline. We're using a cloud environment at the moment. We have an internal Statistics Canada environment that we're using. And as I mentioned previously, we're looking to share a version of this loaded into the UN Global Platform to be able to share with the colleagues internationally. And the goal is to create reusable code that is applicable to cities across Canada and internationally as well. One of the ways that we try to provide this is using open data and tools. This is a real emphasis on our team, using Python and R and using OpenStreetMap data as a source of the open space and road network data. And this really helps to make it shareable and transparent for partners and avoid licensing fees and other potential barriers for calculating the indicator. So as a background, public spaces can be defined as any open piece of land freely accessible to the public and provides recreational areas for residents and helps to enhance the beauty and environmental quality of neighbors. That was pulled from the 11.7.1 training module, including the categorization of open spaces, such as green space, including parks, community gardens, and cemeteries. And we have playgrounds, as well as other sporting grounds, sports fields, etc. A variety of different public squares, plazas, and mini parks, different types of waterfront, including beaches, riverfronts, and other promenade, as well as sections of the street that are used for socializing, enjoyment, and recreation, primarily, as opposed to roads that are mainly used by vehicles. So there are four main components to the indicator that I will be breaking down today. First is the delimitation of the city or urban area to define the geographic scope of analysis, and we did this using the degree of urbanization. Then there's the identification of open public spaces and the calculation of total area occupied by open public space. Thirdly, we have the estimation of total area of land allocated to streets, and the estimation of the share of population with access to open public space within 400-meter walking distance. This is then disaggregated by sex, age, and persons with disabilities. So I will go over the degree of urbanization first, just because this is also a new input at Statistics Canada. We haven't previously worked with a degree of urbanization. A lot of our work focuses on various census geographies, and this one includes more of a focus on grids, essentially. And so to be able to calculate this indicator as closely as we could to international standards, we decided to switch from using potentially something like census metropolitan areas, which are a fairly good proxy if filtered by population density, but using the grid-based approach really helps to be able to compare a little bit more closely to the international methodology. So the degree of urbanization is a standardized approach providing a two-level classification system which defines the urban-rural continuum. It uses population density and spatial characteristics such as the built-up coverage and occurrence of natural barrier features as part of the classification process. On the right, we have an image that's an example from Toulouse in France, pulled from the degree of urbanization methodology that gives you an example of both the grids on the left and the local units on the right, how we can apply the degree of urbanization. So in essence, we first compile the grids using the population and built up area grid. For this case, for the pilot, we do not currently have a population grid to be able to use at the moment within Statistics Canada, but it is something that we're currently working on, both to feed into this project for the final results and also to be able to feed into other urban rural analysis, essentially. So for this one, we use the 2019 Global Human Settlement Layer population grid, which represents approximate global population values using 1 kilometer squared grid cell. We then also use the structural built-up data provided by the European Commission GHSL 2019 built-up area layer as well. And we classify these grids, compute the population density and focal statistics, and then we link to local units. In this case, it is the dissemination blocks at Statistics Canada. So they are, excuse me, the smallest geography that is census geography that is published at Statistics Canada. And they have an average population of around 400 to 700 people in a given dissemination block. However, they do vary widely by size depending on their region. So in urban areas, we'll see dissemination blocks that are essentially one city block bounded by the road on each side. In more rural areas, we'll see it span several square kilometers. That can get quite large when the population is not very dense. Finally, we take this output and we can analyze it, either funneling it into other research projects, or in this case, using as the input for the Sustainable Development Goal 11.7.1 indicator. So this is just an example of the classification, classifying the grid. We have, as I mentioned, it's 2 tiers. We have level 1 and level 2. So level 1 has the urban center, urban clusters, and the rural grid cells. And then we can divide it even more, classify it even more at level 2 with a couple different classifications. And this essentially uses 2 components, primarily the population density of the individual cells by inhabitants per kilometer squared. And we also use the size thresholds of the cluster of cells, the settlement size essentially, in combination with the individual densities. And then depending on the population density, we also might not have a population size criterion if it is quite a rural area and low density area. So this is just a quick example of what it looks like linking to the local aerial units. We have the grid on the left here. This is at the level 2 degree of urbanization. We apply that to the middle image, the dissemination blocks at Statistics Canada. As you can see, this is a good example of kind of the variety of size. We're looking at some sort of settlement in the middle with possibly farmland or other less populated tracts of land outside. And then we receive these linked local aerial units. So for those of you who may be unaware of Canada's geography, it is a very large country with not that many people in it. So when we're looking at a map of this scale, it is overwhelmingly rural in classification when we're looking at it at the degree of urbanization level 1. We have an inset map. The top inset map is let's see if I can use that. There we go. Is the Vancouver area, and then the bottom inset map is the Greater Toronto area. And this really kind of shows the settlement in Canada is quite localized to specific areas. We have some provinces and territories that don't have any units classified as city or as towns in semi-dense areas. And in fact, only about 0.1% of the total land mass is classified as a city based on the degree of urbanization. But we did identify 36 cities across Canada that have the appropriate density and built-up area that would make them applicable for the Sustainable Development Goal indicator. And 55% of Canada's population does reside within these areas classified as cities, followed by about 25% residing in rural areas, and then another 21% of the population in towns and semi-dense areas. So we really do see it is quite localized. This is what it looks like for Vancouver. We're using the 2016 census geographies here at the level 1 degree of urbanization. As you can see, we have the main city clusters, and Vancouver in particular has quite a few constraints for development. We have along the coast here to the west, as well as lots of water bodies in between. In the north, we have a lot of conservation areas and parks, as well as quite mountainous terrain, which impedes development. And to the south and east, we have a combination of agricultural land reserves and other conservation areas as well. And also being a coastal city, there's a lot of wetlands and areas along the rivers that aren't really suitable for development either. So it is quite constrained, and we do see these city clusters. For the level 2 degree of urbanization, we see mainly the same thing, although we're picking up on some dense towns and some suburban areas as well. But mainly we're seeing the main city clusters still. So the current limitations for the degree of urbanization, as I mentioned, this was the first time implementing this. We did find that a few small local aerial units, our dissemination blocks at Statistics Canada, have no population grid cell value associated with those. So that's something that we're hoping to mitigate by using our own internal data to create a grid at some point. And overall, that doesn't have a huge impact on the analysis because most of these places, for example, very small islands in the middle of larger water bodies, there usually isn't a very large population. At the current point, our population inputs also vary by year. As I mentioned, we're using the 2019 global human settlement layer, which obviously has a little bit of a mismatch with our census data from the 2016 census and then 2021 census. So again, using the census data to create the population grids, we will be able to have essentially inputs that have all the same year for this analysis. There's also a little bit of ambiguity to the degree of urbanization methodology that does require some context and local application. So that's just something that we have been working through, getting some advice from Eurostat as well on the application of the specifics of that. But we do have the base methodology at the moment, which we don't expect to have many changes from that based on what we're seeing with current testing of the implementation of some of the finer points of the methodology. So once we have the degree of urbanization, delimiting the geographic scope, we move into collecting the open public spaces data. So in this case, Statistics Canada does not have a comprehensive administrative data set on open spaces at the moment. We do have a partial coverage for certain categories, those 6 categories that I showed earlier. But we are very fortunate to have a wealth of open data available across Canada that provides an alternative authoritative source. So for OpenStreetMap, it's a crowdsourcing web platform of free georeference data. And the real benefit from the OSM data in this particular case is that there is information that is attached to this georeference data. So it's tagged, and in this case, we use those tags to be able to pull relevant information, assess which data points could be included from the 6 classes of open public space data. So for example, we have a list of all of the information that we captured, but essentially we were searching for things like leisure equals park or land use equals cemetery to capture that open public space data. And when we pull that into our processing environment, right now we're using a Jupyter Notebook. We wanted to be able to provide something that was its own, I guess, standalone item that could be shared. We have included a lot of setup information and I guess README content, etc. Within that to be able to help guide the user to which sections are more standardized for the notebook versus which sections are maybe requiring a little bit more local context or application or changes based on the data that you're inputting. So we have been testing out the PyRSM package, which allows us to read local data dumps from PBF data providers, such as GeoFabric or BB Bike. And this makes it possible to parse OSM data faster and make it more feasible to extract data covering larger regions. We also created built-in visual validation, which allows the user to, as they're extracting the OpenStreetMap data, to be able to review what is extracted, how the process is going as they go through the different stages of analysis, to be able to provide a little bit of critical assessment. And one of the reasons that we started with Vancouver is that I grew up in the region. So having that ability to check this process against my local knowledge of the area and the parks and the beaches and other open spaces that I was familiar with was very helpful to be able to provide a bit of that context. So this is an example of what the kind of final outputs look like for the open public space. We have it the Vancouver urban area here, as well as the open public space within the urban area and some of the public spaces just outside the urban area as well. So this is Vancouver. We have kind of downtown Vancouver and Stanley Park here, the North Shore up here, and the University of British Columbia out to the west, and then the various municipalities that make up kind of the greater Vancouver area. And then we have the American border down here, just almost off screen. So to calculate the share of land occupied by open public space, it is just the total area covered by this open public space that we extracted from OpenStreetMap out of the total area of urban Vancouver, essentially. Then we calculated the land allocated to streets. We use the OpenStreetMap network and again use the tagging that's available in OpenStreetMap specifically to allow us to assess the different road types. So OpenStreetMap has quite an array of different options for classifying roads. We have motorways, trunk, residential, etc. And some of those do have data on either total width or number of lanes or width of those lanes, etc. So we created a road width logic. As you can see kind of in this example image, we take each segment of the road network and essentially, if we can, pull in the data from OpenStreetMap that provides that specific width and lane information, or we apply basically standardized width that we assume based on a variety of literature and other sources, and then apply a buffer based on each width of each segment. So again, we're using the PyRSM package to read this road network data in and to be able to filter by the different components. And we create this custom road width function that uses these available lane numbers and widths from OpenStreetMap, assigns it to, and we assign widths to road types with unknown parameters based on essentially Canadian road standards. So I was hoping to be able to show a little live demo of this, but unfortunately my network connection to the cloud server has not been great this morning. So I figured I would just take a quick screenshot and show. So this is an example in Vancouver. We're looking at kind of a main residential area with some of the main trunk roads. For any of you who have been to Vancouver, this is Granville Street, a main trunk road that heads downtown, which is just kind of off screen up here. We have Oak Street as well, which is a main trunk road. So we can kind of see that in these residential areas here, the width is quite uniform in this case, which is probably a combination of the roads actually being quite similar in terms of width due to planning guidelines, but it could also be due to maybe a lack of information about specific lane width, road width, etc. We do see some areas up here where clearly there's a deviation from the kind of classic residential route. We can see that it's actually narrower here, so that suggests that people have gone in and manually modified that to say that this specific road width is less wide. And here as well, we can see kind of the differences between these roads, which if you've driven along these roads like I have, I don't think there's probably a huge difference in width between this section and this section. So that might be, for example, a little bit of lack of data or someone inputting something that is maybe not as correct. But in this case, we do see for Oak Street, it does get kind of narrower and narrower as it goes into the residential area up further north. So in some cases, we do have information that allows us to classify it a bit more particularly. In other ways, we really are relying on kind of the road network estimations. So calculating the access to open public spaces. First, we take all open space polygons within about 400 meters of the Vancouver urban boundary, and this was used to select make sure that access to parks that were just outside the boundary were still analyzed for those living on the edge of that boundary, since we want to make sure that that's included because it is still functionally accessible for the residents. And that's seen in box A here. We have a park that was extracted from OpenStreetMap and the sidewalk network around it. And then we took the vertices from the polygons of the final open space data set, and they were extracted to create a point file that delineates the perimeter of the spaces. So we see that in box B, the 4 vertices at the park. And then these points, along with the OpenStreetMap street network, in this case, using the walking network, essentially, are provided as input layers for Valhalla, which is a multimodal routing service using OpenStreetMap data. And the code for the web service is open source, and a version of it was hosted and run locally for us, which was necessary since we were computing about 67,000 open space points. And that was after some simplification of the vertices. So I think the original unsimplified one was about 250,000 points, which is not really feasible to do on the web version. So hosting locally was important. And this particular service used from Valhalla in this analysis was to calculate an isochrone for each open space point. An isochrone is a polygon that displays an area accessible within a given distance or time. So in this case, the isochrone displayed the area accessible via the street network within 400 meters of each open space point. So we can see that in box C. We have for each of the vertices its own isochrone calculated for that. So clearly, if you're walking, this is a very, I guess, geometrically simple example, but if you're walking from this corner of the park, obviously, if you're doing kind of a zigzag, you're not going to get as far as if, for example, you're just walking in a straight line as far as you can away. So this is kind of the edge, the boundary of where you can get within 400 meters. So the Isochrone polygons were merged together and clipped to the Vancouver urban area in box D. We can see that. And then for the final step, once we have that isochrone layer, we overlay it with the local aerial units, in this case, the dissemination blocks. And so here we have dissemination blocks that are, because it's a very dense urban area, they follow the street network quite closely, which may not always be the case, but we can see, for example, there's one here. 100% of that dissemination block is covered by the isochrone. So we assume that 100% of the population within that local unit has access to an open public space. Obviously, this assumes that the population is evenly distributed among the dissemination blocks, which, given that these are more urban areas because of the nature of the indicator and the assessment that we're doing, usually the density is a little bit more evenly spread than for example, some areas just due to zoning, et cetera, but that is a limitation of the methodology. And then we do find that at the, for example, at the edge here, maybe we have a dissemination block that only has about maybe 20%, 15% coverage of the dissemination block by the access isochrone. So in that case, we assume that only about 20% of the population within that dissemination block has access to open public spaces. So again, here's a little example of what that looks like in downtown Vancouver. So we can see the open spaces here, and then in darker purple, we have the access isochrones around them. So it covers a good chunk of the area, but we do have kind of these gaps here where we can see people living in that area do not have access within 400 meters walking distance. And then we have as well, I guess, waterfront as well here, where there is limited access as well, which is something that we're investigating further just to determine whether or not that is fully no open public spaces in that area, or if potentially there was something misclassified with OpenStreetMap or something like that. And I'll discuss that a bit further about the expansion and how we're trying to make the analysis more robust as we move forward. So the results, I think the results are frankly probably the least interesting part of the presentation. Mainly what we're most excited about is the fully open source prototype of the indicator. We found that 17% of the Vancouver urban area was covered in open public space, and about 89% of the total population has access to open public spaces. However, I will talk about how that number might change a little bit in the future as we modify the methodology. So the outcomes that we have seen here is that we have been able to produce a shareable notebook with customized setup instructions that is fairly agnostic, essentially, to the city that it is being used in. And so we tried to set it up so that all the local parameters are input at the very beginning of the notebook, so that you can kind of customize where your analysis is happening. So you set, for example, the local units at the beginning, where the location of your population data is, the degree of urbanization, or whatever other I guess geographic scope you're using to assess the indicator. So we try to set it up so that as many parameters are set at the beginning with limited intervention or modification as you go through the code. There are, as I mentioned before, we tried to approach it as building blocks. We know that different users might have different data inputs. So for example, we were really missing the street data. For example, other countries or regions might have quite adequate data sets that have more information on street data. So possibly you wouldn't want to use our section on pulling OpenStreetMap width data. You would just want to use your own data set for that purposes. So we kind of have that ability to mix and match with chunks of the code, whether or not you want to take a separate file in and use that for the assessment, or if you want to run through and pull everything from OpenStreetMap and run the isochrones, et cetera, everything like that. So we have started scaling it to test out to other cities. At the moment, we are testing it in Calgary, which is in the province of Alberta. So far, it has held up pretty well, but we have noticed some areas where when we built the first pilot with Vancouver, there were some kind of quirks to Vancouver that were kept, I guess, in the code. So some of the street classifications, for example, were slightly different in Calgary. There were different types of bus lanes or things like that that we had to review and categorize. And I would say that that will possibly be an area where people will have to make more modifications based on their local setup, is when they're trying to determine the street widths, because we assigned it based on Canadian road standards, but possibly in other countries you will have different average or standard road widths for a residential street or trunk roads or other road types as well. We did create a transparent code and process, which we are very excited to be able to share in the coming months. And we think we have a very promising base for expansion and fine-tuning of the analysis. And I think hopefully as we scale across those other cities I mentioned across Canada, we will be able to make it even more agnostic to any particular city and fine-tune any results from that, but also potentially looking at applying it internationally with a test case in another city to see how does it hold up when you have completely different inputs, for example, or you're dealing with other local contexts. So a couple of the limitations that we have at the moment that we're looking to work on is we do know that we have an incomplete capture of some more informal open public spaces. So particularly grass and forested areas, we know at the moment that it does not capture enough of that, and it is a bit trickier in our local context, because we do have some. We can't just pull all grass and forested areas, because there really are some that are not of use or benefit to the local population. I'm thinking of grassy areas that are in the middle of an on-ramp onto a highway. Technically, it's there and it's open public space, but due to pollution from cars, lack of safety, lack of access, it's really not something that people would be using. And the same for forested areas, trying to determine exactly maybe which areas can be accessed and used versus other ones that are not really part of the local neighborhood environment. As I mentioned, I already mentioned the incomplete street width data, which is just one of the factors of working with a lack of data in this area. But I still think it provides a useful opportunity to use what is available, I will say. And then I mentioned we do have some current calculations with the 2016 population. We're looking to update that to 2021. And as I mentioned, with the degree of urbanization, standardize all that data to a specific year. And we do know that the automated workflow does simplify certain steps. So we did consult with a colleague, Dennis Mwaniki at UN Habitat, and you know, he mentioned that there might be issues with limited manual review of open public spaces and functional access points. So, for example, if you have a park with fencing along it, a lot of people, especially when you're disaggregating the data and looking at it by access for various population groups, a lot of people will not be jumping the fence to access the park at any specific point. They will be using the main access points if there's gates or something like that. So That is something we don't take into account at the moment. We just use the vertices of these spaces, but that is something in the future that once we have more of a base for the indicator, maybe we've calculated it all out for all the cities, is something that we would go in and do some more manual edits. But again, I think that's a measure of how much effort you can put into this to get the most precise results versus at this point, we're just looking at can we have a fully automated process that gets us most of the way there, I think. And I think that is really the goal, to have something functional, even if we know there are a couple limitations in this regard. So our next steps, we will be expanding the analysis to more cities across Canada. Right now, we do have we have calculated it by age, sex, and persons with disability, but because that information is confidential, we've just been using a dummy data set so far to be able to provide it within the notebook. That's something that we'll be calculating separately for the indicator due to the data confidentiality. And we will be integrating the newest 2021 population data into these calculations. And then we are hoping to be able to share with other stakeholders and international partners. So if you are interested in learning more about our process, if you want to talk to us more about how we've calculated this, we are very interested to discuss. And if you have any concerns about the methodology, things that maybe we're not taking into account, we would love to hear that feedback and discuss. So we are looking to work to get this on the UN Global Platform within the coming months, and be able to kind of share, as I mentioned before, some code that people can really dig into, because I think obviously presenting this, I hope I've given you a good overview of what the process is like, but it's no substitute for being able to really dive in and possibly test in your own cities. So on that note, thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone attending today. And as I mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out either to me or through Alexander or other UN colleagues. We're very happy to discuss further.
Thank you, Marina. Really great presentation, and good to see how these kinds of things can be automated in the best way possible, or in the most feasible way. So I have now enabled the microphones and cameras for our participants. So if you are not particularly shy, you can now raise your hand and ask your question personally if you wish. I saw there were already a couple of questions in the chat. For instance, there was one question particular with referring to slide. Yeah, I think it was this slide.
I believe it's this one.
Yes.
Yes, I'm just looking through the chat now. Yes, the white space in this is the land area that is within the province of British Columbia, within the Vancouver greater area, but it is not classified as a city based on the degree of urbanization. So this is more suburban areas, for example, not just suburban areas, but we have actually quite a large delta here that is mostly just mud flats and other areas, conservation areas for migratory birds, as well as some farmland in here as well. So it's essentially outside the scope of analysis for the open public space. But we do have some parkland and other areas here as people access the waterfront.
Yeah. Then there were a couple or 2 or 3 people who were asking actually about how you disaggregate the data by sex and for persons with disabilities. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, so I guess that is an area where we will be using Statistics Canada data. We will be pulling from our census data, which we do have classified down to the dissemination block, which is the local area unit we've been using. However, I believe some of it may be published publicly, but not all of the variables are. So that is something where we do have a specific advantage in terms of the population disaggregation, I guess, from our internal resources. So that is one area that I guess we don't necessarily have a good solution for at the moment. If you don't have access to that data, I believe there are some other resources online that provide alternatives to calculating this and trying to estimate population counts by these disaggregated groups, but that is something that we're just going to be using our census data that we have. So that is, I guess, a internal advantage that we have at the moment.
Yeah, and if I may follow up just on this, especially with respect to persons with disabilities, I could imagine that if a person with a disability, a physical disability, for instance, sitting in a wheelchair every day, has access to a public open space nearby, but the public open space is not really accessible to people sitting in a wheelchair because it's full of stairs and so on. How do you plan to accommodate things like that?
Yeah, so for the first, I guess, portion, we were mostly looking at, I guess, calculating it based on someone who has relatively full access. And then as we get closer to the final indicator, once we calculate it for the different timelines, our census data, we are going to be looking at kind of fine-tuning the measurement of access to try to pull in more variables that would look at, like I mentioned, actual access points that are accessible. Maybe there's ramps, or it's there are no stairs at that location and things like that. At the moment, we haven't looked as much into OpenStreetMap data to assess how much of that is available at the moment. I know that there is some information about accessibility, but frankly, that is I think across Canada, we have noticed that there is a lack of really granular information about access to various points. So that might be something that will require a bit more manual intervention or specific research in this case, and possibly a mixture of classifying by the different spaces. So, for example, if you're looking at maybe a local park and we know the context is that it really is the grass meets the sidewalk, then potentially we know that that is probably not as much of a barrier to access as possibly a public plaza where you're integrating it in the middle of the city. You know, there are steps in various points, etc. So that is basically, I guess, under further analysis as we get closer to a final data set of open public space.
Thank you. There was a question by Katja in the chat. Katja, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. I take this opportunity also to remind everyone else, if you have a question, just type it in the chat or raise your hand. So Katja was asking, so how were you able to distinguish public and private spaces using the OpenStreetMap data? And what is your view on the quality of the OpenStreetMap data for official statistics?
We did assess public versus private by some extra tags that are available in OpenStreetMap. There are a couple of places that were tagged, for example, as parks or gardens, but actually you have to pay a fee for entry or something like that, or they're just, for example, private tennis courts or other sports facilities that are not accessible to the public unless you have a membership. So we did use OpenStreetMap does have a tagging option to denote public or private access or access by fee. So we filtered those ones out. That does, if the OpenStreetMap data is not as available for that, that does also require some local knowledge of the accessible ones. Another option, depending on your, I guess, data options, we did originally look at municipal data as a initial input. We were thinking of merging it with the OpenStreetMap data. We didn't end up doing that because we found that the coverage from municipal open data or provincial open data was not as comprehensive. But there are sometimes information and variables from municipal sources. For example, some of them just don't include membership only ones because it's just the public facilities run by the municipality. So you can do some confrontation to determine whether if the municipal open data set does not include this, but it is included in OpenStreetMap, then potentially that's a method to determine that it is not public access, for example. But that does also rely on having an additional data source to confront. And I'll answer the second part of that. I see what is your view on the quality of OpenStreetMap data for official statistics? In Canada, across Canada so far, we have found, especially the open public space data has been fairly comprehensively mapped. I will say the allocation, the classifications are not always correct or the most correct, I would say. Some things are maybe classified as forested space when maybe they're more of a park or things like that. But in total, the collection of I guess open space tags based on cemetery tags or parks or plaza or things like that, we found when we searched for them all, the collection was fairly comprehensive. However, some of the individual tagging is a little bit inconsistent. I especially found that in terms of looking at the OpenStreetMap tagging for the highway equals pedestrian, which shows you kind of pedestrian walking areas within the city. Sometimes I was classified as a plaza polygon that was completely separate that you'd pull from a different tag, but other times it was just classified as a pedestrian highway essentially, and you're pulling that. So if you have to be careful about, I guess the full scope of options you're pulling in, because if your scope is too limited, then you can miss those options, I would say. The quality for official statistics, I think, will depend on the region. As I mentioned, various cities across Canada kind of have different, what I've looked into so far, they have really different coverage in terms of street width data, for example, and how much is filled out. That's very localized and dependent on individual contributors to OpenStreetMap and if they're interested in providing that data. So I would say that that's an area where the quality is quite variable based on location. But overall, I would say from what I've seen in Canada, open public spaces are better defined than the road network data. But it depends how much you're okay with estimating the road widths. For us, providing a minimal kind of area that we were confident in, I think meets our needs at the moment, although we would, of course, like to fine tune if more data becomes available.
Okay, thanks. Just a last, yeah. Okay, so I see Bianca is adding some additional information also into the meeting chat. So we could take maybe one more question if somebody is interested in asking a question. If not, I would like to thank Marina for her presentation, and maybe everyone can join me in just unmuting yourself right now and give Marina a big round of applause. That would be really great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very appreciated. And as I mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have more questions. And if you would like to discuss more about this project or the code we have available, we're happy to share some draft code in the meantime, especially it might not be quite as pretty as the final product. But if this is something that you're actively working on at the moment and you'd like to collaborate in the coming months, please do reach out and we'll keep you in the loop about updates for this project.
Yes, and we will share the slides of today's presentation, and the recording is always on the global network of data officers and statisticians. So please have a look there, or if you have colleagues who are interested in the talk today, just send them there. It will be available sometime later today or tomorrow. All right. Thanks everyone for joining again, and see you next time again for our Global Network webinars. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.